The Zodiac Killer is one of America's most infamous serial killers. With 5 confirmed murders and up to 37 possible murders during the 1960s and 1970s, the Zodiac Killer often targeted couples in secluded areas in and around Northern California. The public has been captivated by the Zodiac Killer because of his relationship with the media. Fairly soon after the first confirmed murder, the Zodiac Killer began sending coded messages taunting police to various newspaper outlets and police stations. He signed these letters with a circle and a plus sign, a symbol that was consistently used throughout his killing career. While the Zodiac Killer case remains unsolved, suspects have come forward and continue to come forward to this day. Ultimately, though, no one has been confirmed as the actual Zodiac Killer. Hello everyone, and welcome to REDRUM, a murder history podcast dedicated to exposing all angles of a serial murderer's story. This is the start of my deep dive into different serial killers, starting with the topic matter of this podcast, the Zodiac Killer. Within this podcast are descriptions of violence and murder, so listener discretion is advised. Listen close, but not too closely, and remember to enjoy. This first murder was not directly associated with the Zodiac Killer, but in later messages sent, the credit for these murders were placed on the Zodiac. On June 4th, 1963, football star Robert Domingos, who was at the time 18 years old, took his fiancée Linda Edwards to a remote beach near the Gaviota State Park in California. As students at Lompoc High School, these two teenagers were set to graduate the very next day after this incident occurred. Deciding to participate in the annual senior skip day, but not wanting to go to the school celebration party, the teenagers traveled in Robert's car, which when arriving to their destination was parked off of Highway 101. The couple was suspected missing that same night when they failed to come home, and the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office was contacted by their worried parents. The next day, Robert's father went looking in the last place the couple's friends knew they had visited and found Robert's Pontiac on the side of the road. Robert's father did not find the couple, as they were later found in a driftwood beach shack by the brother of Linda's friend, 19-year-old Lee Nasa. The teenagers had been shot multiple times and had been haphazardly thrown into the shack. It was also determined the shack was set on fire, as investigators found half-burnt leaves around the shack and charring along the outside. Along the beach, investigators also found matches, ropes, 3 ammunition boxes, and shells from .22 caliber bullets, which they took as evidence in relation to these murders. It was later found after the autopsies that Robert was shot 11 times and Linda 9 times. It was believed that both teenagers fought off the attacker, and in particular, Robert had bruises covering his entire face and his upper chest. Robert was found face down in the shack, still wearing his surfing shorts. Linda, on the other hand, did not have it as easy, and her body was found lying on top of Robert, face up, void of any clothing. Santa Barbara detectives called the murderer sloppy and the murderer an amateur. However, even though there were numerous pieces of evidence left behind and numerous suspects brought in for questioning, no one was found guilty of these murders. Speculation that this was the doing of the Zodiac Killer was only brought about by an employee of the Sheriff's Department, William Baker, at a much later date than the murders actually occurred. And while the Zodiac often claimed his crimes, the Gaviota murders were never specifically mentioned in any of his messages or postcards, but evidence of the crime does match how the Zodiac Killer would normally handle his murdering sprees. The next possible murder, thought to be the second hit by the Zodiac, occurred on October 30th, 1966. Sherry Jo Bates was an 18-year-old Riverside Community College student. Sherry had planned to spend the evening at her college's campus library until 9 p.m., using the afternoon to study and work on a research project. This was evidence supported by her leaving a note for her father before she had left their home, and is also corroborated with later eyewitnesses who would come forward and state Sherry's whereabouts at specific times within the day. While not much information is known about her murder, it is speculated she died between 9 p.m. and 12 a.m., and neighbors around the library had also reported screaming around 10:30 p.m. After not coming home, Bates' father called the police and reported her missing at 5:30 a.m. She was later found 100 yards from her Volkswagen Beetle by a local groundskeeper the next morning, near the library she had visited the night before, brutally beaten and stabbed to death. 10 feet from her body, a cheap, paint-splattered Timex watch and the footprint of a shoe were found side by side. And on Sherry's car, greasy handprints were scattered around the entire outside. Through later research, it was found that those fingerprints did not match hers or any of her friends. And it was also found that the murderer had disabled the ignition of Sherry's Volkswagen Beetle, most likely to lure her from the safety of her locked car doors. Later autopsy results showed she struggled to fight back, so much so that she was still clutching the perpetrator's hair even after her death. Within 24 hours of finding Sherry Jo Bates, 75 individuals had been interviewed and screened, but none were accused of her murder, and there was never a definite suspect for her murder. Through eyewitnesses, we do know there was a man, 19 or 20 years old, who had been lurking around Bates' car in the woods near the library the night of her disappearance. But the man, nor a mysterious car, could be identified. Linking this to the Zodiac Killer was a postcard sent by the Zodiac Killer himself, taunting the police while congratulating them on finding out that he had murdered Sherry Jo Bates. This next murder is not a theoretical or possibility when placing blame on the Zodiac. This murder is the very first murder that was confirmed by the Zodiac Killer himself, which is corroborated by his first letter that was sent out. On December 20th, 1968, only 5 days before Christmas, Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday left Betty's parents' house together for their first date. After only knowing each other for about 2 weeks, both teenagers went to a local high school holiday concert, mingling with friends and classmates. After the get-together, David drove his station wagon to a secluded area near a gas station on Lake Herman Road, locally known as Lover's Lane. We don't know the exact details of what happened between the time of their arriving and the time of their murders, but we do know they were not expecting this outcome from their first date. When Betty's parents realized how late the night had become, they began to worry and went to the police for help. Unfortunately, they received the heartbreaking news that both teenagers were found by Stella Medeiros as she was on her way to pick up her son from a practice. The station wagon had been shot through the back window. Betty was found 28 feet from the car, 5 shots into her back in a closed pattern, and David was shot behind the ear and along his back. Tragically, David was found alive on the scene, but never made it to the hospital. During investigation, there were a few leads that detectives would follow, interrogations of friends and family, but with testimonies and evidence from the crime scene, none were tied to or suspected of their murders. Later, this murder was linked with a serial murderer who we now know as the Zodiac Killer, due to the fact that after committing another murder at a later date, he called the police and admitted in a monotone voice, "I also killed those kids last year." This next murder took place on September 27th, 1969. Now, this incident has a witness, Brian Hartnell, who was one of the victims that survived the attack. So within this description, we have a recounted firsthand experience of what happened. So it's going to sound a little bit different than the last couple of murders that we went through. 2 Pacific Union College students, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, were picnicking at Lake Berryessa, reuniting after a long separation. Lying in a remote location of the lake, relaxing and talking on a picnic blanket, a man approached the couple wearing an odd ensemble, all black, and stated he was an escapee from the local prison, and began talking to them. After several minutes, the man tied up the couple with plastic clothesline and began stabbing the both of them. Brian was attacked first, getting stabbed 6 times, then Cecilia 10 times. Cecilia had the brunt of the attack, and police concurred that this was a somewhat sexual attack, as Cecilia had not only been stabbed in the chest and back, but through her sexual organs and private parts. A nearby fisherman heard the couple screaming for help and alerted park rangers, who arrived at the scene when both parties were in their most critical conditions. The couple was taken to the Queen of the Valley Medical Center by ambulance, where Cecilia fell into a coma and died. But Brian did survive. Not even an hour after the tragic attempted murder of Brian and the murder of Cecilia, the killer called the authorities, claiming this incident and an earlier murder. With this call, police were able to track that the killer had been in downtown Napa and were able to collect fingerprints and eyewitness descriptions of those that had visited that phone booth. At the crime scene, tire tracks, shoe prints, and a handwritten message on the side of Brian's door were all collected as evidence for this crime. Other serial killers, such as Ted Bundy, were ruled out due to the fingerprints collected, and the Zodiac was named the main suspect due to his admission of this murder through the phone call. This was also later corroborated as the Zodiac killer's doing due to the handwriting of the message on the side of the door. This next murder is the last confirmed Zodiac killing that we do specifically know most of the details for. This resulted in the death of 29-year-old Paul Stine. And this was a very big media explosion. This is what got most people into trying to figure out who the Zodiac killer actually was. Just 2 weeks after the attacks on Brian and Cecilia, Paul was targeted by the Zodiac, which, when looking back on earlier cases, this is a unique instance where the Zodiac seemed to differ from his usual killing pattern and procedures. But this also has something to do with one of the many letters that he wrote where he stated he would only be killing and making it look like robberies instead of actually what he desired to do. This case was first thought to be a simple robbery gone bad, but was later confirmed by the Zodiac himself in one of his many media letters. On October 11th, in San Francisco, Paul Stine picked up a fare around 10 p.m. This originated near the St. Westin Hotel in the Theater District of San Francisco. He picked up his passenger and began to drive to their destination in Presidio Heights. Paul Stine stopped the car for his passenger to leave. The passenger got out, and he was instantly shot at point-blank range on the side of his head, and it is believed that he died instantly. We have eyewitness testimony that a white male, about 25 to 30 years old, wearing dark clothes, was seen taking a part of Paul's shirt and wiping down the car. Unfortunately, police dispatchers misheard the fact that the male was wearing dark clothes and instantly announced that they were looking for a black male. After realizing their mistake, authorities went back and tried to do a more detailed search, but it was already too late. The Zodiac killer had evaded them once more. It is also thought that the Zodiac killer walked right past police cruisers and police on the street due to the fact that they had misheard the information of his description. Now, I have 2 last instances where the Zodiac killer is thought to be at fault, but in official records, these cases are unsolved and the perpetrators are still unknown. This first instance was a close call, but luckily resulted in no casualties. On March 22, 1970, Kathleen Johns, along with her baby daughter, were heading west on Highway 132 near Modesto, California, to visit her mother. Kathleen recounted that a car had honked at her, and she'd pulled over thinking it was the authorities or that something was wrong with her car. A man had stepped out and walked over to her car. The manner in which he did so had scared her, and he seemed threatening and was brandishing some kind of weapon. So, her being scared, she drove away to a secluded spot, but the man seemed to follow her. After realizing she couldn't drive away from the man, Kathleen took her daughter and herself and ran into a field. The man drove back and forth for about 90 minutes, and after he had stopped, John stated the man tried to find her using his flashlight, but eventually gave up with that as well. She ended up walking to a gas station, where she was then picked up by the police and taken to a police station. Later, her car was found gutted and torched. This last instance is an ongoing missing persons case, and not much is known about the victim or the circumstances of her disappearance. On September 6, 1970, Donna Lass, a nurse at the Sahara Tahoe Hotel and Casino, worked until about 2 a.m. But later that day, both her employer and landlord received phone calls from an unknown male trying to claim last left town. The police haven't really investigated this case due to the fact that there is a statement that she left of her own free will. But it is suspected that around this time, the Zodiac was still active and committing heinous acts of murder and crime due to his many postcards and letters sent past this date, September 6, 1970. While the Zodiac killer case is still unsolved, there have been many strides in recent years to use new DNA sequencing techniques and other scientific methods to find who the Zodiac killer may be. Ongoing investigations into these murder cases still persist to this day, and public interest in this case is ever more prevalent due to the age of social media. If you wanted to look into more information on these murders, I would recommend going to thezodiackiller.com. There's a whole website that is dedicated to explaining every single one of these murders, some of the many theories, going through most of the suspects throughout the case. I would like to thank you so much for listening to REDRUM, a murder history podcast, and in our next episodes about the Zodiac killer, we are going to do a deep dive into the killer's letters and media outreaches, as well as looking into more of the suspects named and released. Again, thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to come back.